My name is Chloe, and I have just begun a 12-month prison sentence. My cell is not made of concrete and steel, but of old mahogany and inherited memories. My warden is not a guard, but a legally binding document. I am not a criminal, yet I am incarcerated. This is my marital prison. My husband, Matthew, and I have decided to divorce. The problem is not a lack of resolve, but the architect of our marriage contract. It was not drafted by a sharp-minded attorney, but by my eccentric, now-deceased uncle, a master jeweler by trade and a whimsical philosopher at heart who fervently believed in the alchemy of relationships. And in his wisdom he sewed a diabolical clause into the very fabric of our union, to dissolve our marriage without catastrophic financial loss, and the losses at stake were colossal, encompassing everything we had built and inherited. We are obligated to cohabitate for one final, excruciatingly long year. 365 days, not in a neutral space, but within the echoing, dusty halls of his old Victorian mansion. And we are not merely to coexist like indifferent ghosts. We must adhere to a set of absurd, non-negotiable rules etched onto a tarnished silver plaque mounted in the grand foyer as if they were sacred commandments. The rules are as follows. Rule 1, each morning we must prepare and consume breakfast together. Rule 2, together we must feed the stray cat that frequents the wraparound porch. Rule 3, each evening we must play one single game of chess. The penalty for violating any of these rules is the automatic and total forfeiture of all marital assets. It was a nightmare, a gilded cage with a timer. We entered this house not as a couple, but as adversaries, each counting the seconds until our liberation. The first week was a study in silent warfare. Our shared breakfasts were prepared in a frigid silence, the only sounds the aggressive cracking of eggs and the furious sizzle of bacon in the pan. We seasoned our food not with salt and pepper, but with a simmering resentment for one another. The stray cat, a scrawny ginger Tom with the torn ear, whom we cynically named Shylock, for he seemed to demand his pound of flesh, would hiss at Matthew with surprising vehemence. Our evening chess games were not games of strategy, but brutal, wordless battles. Each move was an accusation, each captured piece a small victory in our private war. We were two specters haunting the same space, our every interaction defined by the chasm of past hurts and failed expectations. But then a curious thing happened. On a rainy Tuesday in the third week, I lost my focus and grossly oversalted the omelet. I braced myself for the sarcastic remark, the familiar eye roll that had become the punctuation of our later years. It never came. Matthew took a bite, winced, and then, to my utter astonishment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It's fine," he said, his voice quieter than I had heard it in years. "Reminds me of the terrible food I lived on during my student years." And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we both smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it was a crack in the immense icy wall that stood between us. That tiny fracture began to widen. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence began to thaw. We started to communicate. At first it was laced with irony, a safe way to engage without vulnerability. A comment on the weather. A cynical observation about Shylock's increasing entitlement. But then the irony gave way to genuine curiosity. Over the chessboard, instead of plotting each other's destruction, we began to talk. We reminisced about our first awkward dates, laughing at the memory of the movie where he had spilled popcorn all over his lap. We recalled the hilarious disaster of our first joint vacation, when the rental car broke down in the middle of nowhere. We even began to introduce stakes into our chess games. If I won, Matthew would do the washing up for the week. If he won, I had to choose the movie for our Friday night. We were rediscovering each other, not as the caricatures we had become, the cold, ambitious careerist and the needy, hysterical wife, but as the people we once were. I discovered he wasn't just a man consumed by his ambitions, but a boy who had gotten lost in them, who was tired and longed for simplicity. He saw in me not a nagging shrew, but a woman who had simply wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be valued beyond the functional role of a wife. We began to anticipate our strange mandated rituals. The shared breakfast became the quiet, peaceful start to our day, a moment of connection rather than a contractual obligation. The evening chess game transformed into a sacred space for conversation, a time to unpack the day's thoughts and dreams without judgment. And Shylock no longer hissed. He now purred, a rusty rumbling sound, and had taken to sleeping at the foot of our bed. Our bed. because at some point the spare bedroom had been abandoned and we had begun sharing a room again, our initial separation feeling as absurd and distant as the rules that had forced us back together. And then it arrived, the final evening, the 365th day. We sat across from each other at the chessboard, the ancient pieces standing like silent witnesses. The air in the library was thick and heavy with unspoken words. We both knew that tomorrow the doors would swing open. We could walk out, legally free, financially secure. We would have our freedom. But that word, which had once been our battle cry, now felt hollow, a synonym for a profound and terrifying loneliness. Matthew made his move, a quiet, decisive slide of his queen. He then looked up, his gaze meeting mine directly, no longer focused on the board but on me. "Checkmate," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I looked down. It was true. The game was over. He had won. "I know this was all just a contract, Chloe," he began, his voice trembling with a vulnerability I hadn't heard since we were young. "I know these rules were just a madman's game. But I don't want to have won this. I don't want any of this to end." My heart stopped. These were not lines from a script. This was not a strategy. It was the raw, unvarnished truth, and it echoed the very feeling that had been growing in my own heart. The rules, I managed to say, my own voice unsteady, they forced us to stop, to just be still, to actually look at each other again. "And now," he said, reaching across the chessboard and taking my hand in his grip firm and warm, "can we throw this stupid contract away and just start over? Not because some plaque on the wall tells us to, but because we want to. Just us." I looked at our intertwined fingers, resting amidst the chess pieces on the board where he had just declared his victory. I looked at Shylock, curled up and purring contentedly on the sofa, a permanent fixture in our lives. And I understood with a clarity that washed over me like a wave that the best chess move of my life would not be a clever defense or a strategic retreat. It would be a surrender. A glorious, willing capitulation to the beautiful, unexpected thing we had found in this mad, wonderful house. "Okay," I whispered, a real tearful smile finally breaking through. "But you're making breakfast tomorrow." I oversalted the last one.